Let's use supply and demand analysis to look at the effect of tariffs on the market for steel. Now, steel is a good that's traded internationally. Americans consume a lot of steel. We use steel to produce buildings, we use steel to produce cars, we use steel to produce all sorts of stuff, but we don't make all the steel domestically. We can look now at the effect of restrictions on international trade on producers of steel, consumers of steel, and the US government. So we begin with the supply and demand diagram. Okay. Price on the y-axis, quantity in millions of metric tons, is on the x-axis, and American steel consumers have a standard downward sloping demand curve for steel. At higher prices, they want less steel. At lower prices, they want more steel. Now, where are they going to get this steel? Again, I mentioned a second ago that steel is traded in a world market. We're going to assume that that world market is so big and there's so many producers that they're effectively willing to supply as much steel as Americans could possibly want for $363 per metric ton. Now, in order to find how much Americans consume, or how much steel Americans get, simply find the intersection of the demand curve with this world supply curve. And we're going to say for this problem that Americans consume and use 10.2 million metric tons of steel. Now, as we go through this, I'm going to periodically refresh myself with a sip of this delicious Coca-Cola, which will become more relevant again here in just a second. Incidentally, I was going to say that Coke didn't pay for product placement here, but actually if you go to the second floor of Cooney Hall here at Sanford University, you'll be in the Coca-Cola Student Commons. So I guess in some indirect sense, maybe they did. We've got American steel consumers. Let's talk about American steel producers. We're going to have an upward sloping supply curve for steel produced in the United States, because we're going to say that American steel producers are a fairly small part of the global market. So this is going to be a reasonable approximation of American steel production. Something that's kind of cool about this is that the intersection between the American supply curve for steel and the world supply curve for steel shows us the point past which it is no longer economically efficient for Americans to produce steel. So, for every unit of steel over here, Americans are the low-cost producers. Every unit of steel from unit 0 to the 7.4 millionth metric ton, Americans are the low-cost producers. Past this point, it's cheaper and it's more efficient to buy the steel on the world market. So we have 10.2 million metric tons of steel consumed in the United States, 7.4 million metric tons produced in the United States. The rest of it, 2.8 million metric tons, comes from the world market in the form of imports. So we buy this from abroad. Now, steel tariffs generally tend to be a fairly popular policy. Steel companies love them because they raise the price of steel. A lot of voters love them because they think that steel jobs are kind of nice to have in the United States. So a bunch of people go to the politicians and say, well, we would really, really like it if you protected us from foreign competition. If you were to impose a tariff on foreign producers of steel. In short, a tax that foreign producers have to pay at the border. And let's suppose that tariff, that tax, is $85 per metric ton. So here's where we are. We have now a world price of $363 per metric ton, at which Americans use 10.2 million metric tons of steel, and Americans produce 7.4 million metric tons of steel. We get an increase in the price of steel from the imposition of a tariff by the US government. They impose a tariff of $85 per metric ton to raise the price to $448 per metric ton of steel. Now, this is where things get interesting. If the price goes up, if the price of steel goes up, then it stands to reason that American producers are going to want to produce more steel. And indeed they are. So American steel production is going to increase, in this case, say to 7.9 million metric tons of steel. Let me erase this little bit about imports here. And yay, we're now producing more steel in the US. Everybody's happy. Except for the fact that not everybody's happy. Because in addition to having an upward sloping domestic supply curve, we have a downward sloping domestic demand curve. As prices rise, Americans buy less steel. Say they now buy only 9.6 million metric tons of steel. This Coke is really good, but there's something weird about it. Something kind of off. I think about this. Not really sure what that is. We'll talk about it in a little bit, maybe. Okay, now that I've got my bearings back and we're talking about the U.S. steel market again, we're in a position to do a little bit of geometry. Pardon me. We can estimate the increase in producer surplus, or the increase in gains from trade that go to producers. We can estimate the change in gains from trade coming out of the pockets, perhaps, of consumers. And then we can also figure out how much money the government's getting in tariff revenue. So, let's begin with the producer. The producer, steel producers, are going to see an increase in their gains from trade equal to the area of that trapezoid there. Now then, how do we know that? Well, they're doing two things. First, they're producing more steel. So they're increasing steel production from 7.4 to 7.9 million metric tons, and they're able to command a higher price for each metric ton of steel that they're able to produce. So, they produce more steel, they sell that steel for more money, and they increase their gains from trade by the area of this trapezoid. Okay, now the formula for the area of a trapezoid is base 1 plus base 2 times height divided by 2. So the area of this trapezoid is going to be 650 There we go. Okay, it's going to be $650,250,000. Now take a moment and make sure that you know how to do this. You take the base, or one base of the trapezoid, add it to the second base of the trapezoid, multiply it by the height, divide that by 2, you should get 650.25 million. Base 1 here is 7.4, or 7.4 million rather. Base 2 is 7.9 million. The height is 85. We should get $650.25 million. Okay. Now then, we can look and see how this affects consumers as well. We'll do this with blue. So producers get more, they get more gains from trade. Producers, on the other hand, are paying more for steel, and they're getting less of it. So, the change in consumer surplus is this big blue outlined trapezoid. going from 0 to 9.6 million metric tons of steel on the top, 10.2 million metric tons of steel on the bottom, and with a price, once again, or a price increase of $85 per metric ton of steel. Now then, in this case, what we want to do is exactly the same thing, with one exception. We have slightly different numbers. In this case, we want to do basically the same thing, except that we have slightly different numbers. Base 1, we'll say, is 9.6. Base 2 is 10.2. The height is 85. So base 1 plus base 2 times height divided by 2. Consumers are losing $841.5 million in gains from trade. Another sip of Coke. Again, it's good, but there's, again, like I said, just something weird about it. Can't quite put my finger on it. Okay. Well, again, like I said, we can probably talk about that, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, in addition to the gains from trade that go to producers and the gains from trade that come out of the pockets of consumers, the government is going to earn some revenue. The government is going to earn some revenue, and the government's revenue is going to be equal to the quantity of steel that is imported times the tariff. So here Americans are now importing 1.7 million metric tons of steel, paying a tariff of $85 per metric ton on each ton of steel. This gives the government revenue of $144,500,000. Now take a second and add these together. So producers get an additional $650,250,000. The government gets an additional $144.5 million. If we add those together, it's, what is that? $794.75 million. So the increase in producer surplus plus the tariff revenue does not add up to the reduction in gains from trade that's coming out of the pockets of consumers. So we might wonder, well, where are all these extra gains from trade coming from? Now then, if you're looking astutely, you'll notice we got a triangle here and a triangle here. And there are a couple of things going on here. A couple of things that are going on here. First, we have what's called deadweight loss. Okay. Deadweight loss. Now, what do we mean by deadweight loss? Well, remember that there's all of these tons of steel over here that are worth more to consumers than they cost to buy on the world market. So, people are willing to pay more than $363 a piece for each of these tons of steel. They could pay $363 if we had free trade. They can't because of the tariff. So this deadweight loss represents gains from trade that we sacrifice because those trades are never made. Well, how much is that? Well, it's the area of a triangle. Base of 0.6 times height of 85. Divide that by 2. And we get a deadweight loss. We get a deadweight loss of $25.5 million. $25.5 million from what we might call domestic underconsumption. We don't get as much steel as we would like. But you might wonder, what about the American steel producers, who now have more jobs, better jobs perhaps, higher wages. Well, recall what we said a little bit ago. Past this point, it is no longer economically efficient for us to produce steel in the United States. Producing steel requires fuel, it requires labor, it requires capital, it requires land, it requires all sorts of things. And what the supply curve tells us, what the domestic supply curve tells us, is that all of those resources would be better used producing pretty much anything else. Those resources would be better used producing anything else. So here, we're actually wasting resources. So this is the value of wasted resources. These are gains from trade that we don't get because we're simply wasting resources. And we're wasting resources to the tune of $21,250,000. That's resources that we just waste, producing steel inefficiently, using labor, capital, land, fuel, all sorts of stuff to produce steel when we could be using it to produce medical services. We could be using it to produce cars. We could be using it to produce guitar lessons. We could be using it to produce anything that's not steel. Instead, as a result of the tariff, it is in the best interests of steel producers to waste these resources producing more steel. You should notice something. Next time you have an opportunity to look at a soft drink or to get a soft drink, look at the ingredients. Look at the ingredients. So ingredients on this bottle of Coke: carbonated water, high fructose corn syrup, caramel color, phosphoric acid, natural flavors, and caffeine. Carbonated water, high fructose corn syrup. Well, that's odd. Why in the world do we sweeten Coke with high fructose corn syrup? If you go pretty much anywhere else in the world, Coke is sweetened the way God intended it. It's sweetened with sugar. But in the United States, we sweeten with high fructose corn syrup. The logic of the economics of international trade can help us understand why it is that we sweeten Coke with corn syrup in the United States rather than sugar like everyone else in the world. And specifically, it's because it is really, 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 really hard, really expensive to import sugar into the United States. Since sugar in the US is really, really expensive, we consume less of it. And we turn toward a substitute, corn syrup. So, we're wasting resources producing steel. We are not getting as much steel as we would like, or we would be able to get with global free trade. And we can apply the exact same logic to anything else that is subject to tariffs or any other sort of control on import or international trade. Like, for example, sugar. The sugar that would go into the production of Coca-Cola, or Pepsi, or Mountain Dew, or whatever happens to be your preferred poison. As a result of restrictions on international trade, we get less steel, we waste resources producing that steel, and by applying the same logic to other goods that are traded internationally, we realize that we sweeten Coke with corn syrup instead of sugar. And that is a fairly simple walkthrough of the economics of tariffs and international trade.